Hello, everyone. I'm Ernie Humphrey, the CEO of FP&A Webinars. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join us for our webinar today, Driver-Based Planning and Forecasting, Headcount, and Revenue Predictability. I would like to thank our sponsor, Centage, whose strong commitment to thought leadership helps us make this webinar possible today. Companies can't afford to let a static budget or inflexible planning programs serve as strategic anchors which inhibit business agility, the ability to respond and react effectively to dynamic market conditions. The concept of driver-based planning and forecasting continues to garner more attention from CFOs and FP&A leaders. Is this attention warranted or just unwarranted hype? How do companies get from the theory of driver-based planning and forecasting to practical applications? Today, our featured speaker, renowned FP&A thought leader James Myers, will discuss the pros and cons of rolling, driver-based, and integrated planning and forecasting frameworks, an assessment of the relative effectiveness of tools companies are leveraging for planning and forecasting, discuss how to improve the predictability of two key drivers of financial success, employee headcount and sales, and the role that AI may play in defining the next horizon of effective forecasting and budgeting. Before I delve into the content, I'm going to offer a few quick words about FP&A webinars, cover a few housekeeping items, review our learning objectives for the webinar, and then I'm going to welcome our featured speaker, James Myers, to the webinar. Now on to the exciting housekeeping items. Anyone interested in CTP or FP&A credit, you'll need to answer all the polling questions asked during the webinar and remain on for the duration of our webinar. If you have any questions on CTP or FP&A credit, please send me an email to ernie@360thoughtleadership.com. Again, any questions about CTP or FP&A credit, email me at ernie@360thoughtleadership.com. We'd love to hear from you today, so we encourage you to ask questions in the questions area of your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll do our best to get to your questions at the tail end of the webinar when we have our Q&A session. Fear not, if we do not get to your questions, we will follow up with you directly after the webinar. Finally, we appreciate your consideration in taking a short survey at the end of the webinar, as we always strive to maximize the ROI we offer our event attendees for their valuable time. Now the learning objectives, which are our value proposition for investing an hour of your time here with us today. We'd like you to be able to create a planning vision and leveraging by understanding the dynamics of the FP&A value cycle, understand current and emerging techniques in budgeting, planning, forecasting, and the related technologies, and to be able to identify specific opportunities to leverage technology to increase the strategic value delivered by the FP&A function at your company. It's now my distinct pleasure to welcome our featured speaker to the webinar, James Myers, CEO and founder of FP&A Strategy Consulting, a company focused on accelerating finance transformation. James is passionate about FP&A and has presented at various finance summits and on several of my webinars. He's a qualified chartered accountant and has held various finance and operations leadership roles in multinationals such as Dell and Nokia, and he has clients such as Hewlett-Packard. James, the floor is yours, my friend. Please take it away.
Thanks, Ernie. I don't know if you can go a slide back just on the introduction slide. Oh no, you're taking that one out. Okay, so just very quickly, a little bit about myself. I've been working in finance for almost 25 years in various roles and really passionate about technology. And it's really difficult to not be passionate about technology when you live here in Silicon Valley. When I started FP&A strategy, I was inspired by the startup movement and wanted to bring these thoughts and ideas to my world. My hope was to help finance teams move away from the daily, monthly, repetitive grind and really start to begin to add more value to their business partners throughout the organization. It's been an incredible journey, and I've had the privilege to work with some great people, but the one thing that has always amazed me is the speed of change in technology and how it impacts the world we know. And finance is no exception to that. In this webinar, I hope to share some of the experience and thoughts for the future, but I don't let the discussion stop there. I'd love to hear from you through the various means, but on this topic, because I think this area is an area that is continuing to evolve, especially when we think about how artificial intelligence, etc., is impacting the world of finance. On a personal note, my life is not all about technology and finance. In my spare time, I'm also a passionate scuba diver. I've just arrived back from a trip to Costa Rica and would definitely recommend diving there if you have the chance. But enough about me. Let's get on with the webinar. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the very beginning. In 1447, Pacioli invented the double entry system. The thoughts of the double entry system and the ideas have stood the test of time, and the double entry system is still used in accounting today. So if you think about, not a lot of innovation has happened over the many years since then. It was only in 1921 when GM almost went bankrupt did the concept of planning as we know it really come to the fore. In the book that written by Alfred Sloan, the book that written by Alfred Sloan, My Years at GM, he wrote about GM almost running out of cash. And it wasn't because of any fraud or anything like that. It was because they just had bought too much inventory. Sloan spent many years after that developing a new system that would become the basis of forecasting and budgeting as we know it today. I also included in 1972 SAP first starting up, and we can see that as we sort of getting into the 2000s, the technology around finance and accounting is starting to develop. My favorite program of all time, Microsoft Excel, was invented or started in 1985 by Microsoft, and actually it was only available on Windows in 1987. And then software as a service, we see early starts in 2003, but really coming to the fore in the most recent years. Okay, next slide.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump in here. We're going to kind of set the stage for us a little bit, James, and help you define that content. So we're going to go ahead and launch that first polling question. And we are asking the audience to share with us which of the following budget and forecasting techniques your company currently leverages, and encourage you to choose all that apply. So we have top-down budgeting, bottom-up budgeting. So if you have a combination of both, please select both. Activity-based budgeting, driver-based modeling, predictive modeling. So this will really help James and I frame the conversation today, see kind of where you're at in the process and where there might be the most interest in adding all of the great color and expertise that James gives to the table. So I appreciate everyone's consideration in answering all of the polling questions. Again, those of you interested in CTP or FP&A credit will need to answer all of the polling questions during the webinar today. Going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for just a few more seconds. Then we're going to take a quick peek at the results. We'll get James' thoughts, and then James will start to get into the meat of the presentation and talk about why we need planning in the modern era with all the dynamics going on. So let's go ahead and close that, and let's go ahead and share those results. You have any initial thoughts that come to mind? Any surprises, James, here?
Yeah, so I think the top-down and bottom-up planning is a very typical planning methodology that we use, and it's pretty much the basis for most planning that is done. I'm really impressed to see that driver-based modeling is at 29%. I know people can select as many options as they like, and I think that it's great to see that, that's one of the areas that is starting to really take off, because I believe that does help us really get a deeper understanding of the underlying assumptions that have been built into the planning models, whereas the top-down and bottom-up don't necessarily give us the detail. Predictive modeling is at 15%. I think that is that's a great thing to see as well, as we start to get into the age of machine learning and artificial intelligence and things like that. I suspect that number is going to start to creep up as well. So if we can go on to the next slide.
All right. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for answering the polling question. Back to you, James.
So why do we need planning in the modern era? So as we saw with Alfred Sloan, the challenges of in 1921 were pretty much the same as we have today. There's a high degree of uncertainty. The economies continue to change, and we constantly see new threats in the marketplace. And this taken from the startup way by Eric Ries kind of highlight some of the bigger challenges that we're seeing in the marketplace right now. The idea of this globalization and the rise of new global competitors. You know, we weren't able to just ring fence, you know, competition from, you know, in country wise or even region wise, etc. Nowadays, we have competitors from all over the world, with a lot of companies from Asia, you know, especially India and China, as well as Europe, competing in the US, as well as the other way around, where we constantly see these global competitors getting stronger and stronger. Software eating the world. I think we're seeing that, you know, the classic examples are Uber and Airbnb, but we're seeing software in pretty much every arena being, you know, looking at new ways of being able to streamline and process solutions, so that making it easier for people to purchase products or select music or all sorts of different things. So really disruptive. Increased speed of technology and changing consumer preferences. We can constantly see companies going out of fashion. Take Groupon, it was a complete, you know, huge hit, and then suddenly it's gone out of fashion again. So, you know, these things can constantly changing, and the large number of high growth startups entering the industry. So these are all very much focused on kind of the common thread of uncertainty, where we constantly see competitors being overtaken by some of these some startups or even these global competitors. So being able to plan and understand where not only your internal risks but also your external risks, similar to Alfred Sloan, are critical to being able to understand how we can plan better. All right, next slide. So to give you just an overview, this is the vision of FP&A strategy we started with in 2012, and it's really this interaction between strategy, business, and data. And I think the pivotal piece of this whole thing is the FP&A teams that are sitting, or even the finance team, if you don't necessarily have an FP&A team, sitting in between all of these intersections. One of the critical things and getting to a deeper understanding is just understanding the strategy of the company and how that's driving the company forward, and the vision of the business. I think once we understand that vision of the business, I think when we talk a little bit about business partnering and how we work closely with the business to achieve that strategy, I think, you know, this is where we're starting to see things like budgeting and planning becoming a key part of a business, and being able to drive that business forward. So, you know, we talk a bit about strategy, and there's some research that's been done where we look at what sort of strategy, what people understand about strategy, and the numbers are pretty low. But when you talk about understanding the budget, then you probably get a better response, because people understand the budget a lot better. The idea is, my kind of vision is that the budget should be all about strategy. When the budget is happening, what we really need to be focusing on is really taking the ideas of the strategy and building that into a financial plan to be executed by the business. And I think that's kind of the key difference in my mind between a budget and a forecast or a plan. The forecast is more a pulse on exactly what is going on in the business, where we are today, and how we tracking. A budget, typically done once a year, sometimes twice a year, is really about how do we translate the vision and the strategy of our company into a financial document, so that it's executed against, and the business can execute against that. And I think one of the key things for a finance organization, one of the things that really drives the cycle, is for finance, and especially FP&A, to be more involved in the strategy. We're going to touch on some of the other areas which aren't not necessarily that relevant to this, because I think the budgeting piece falls in really that translating of strategy into business. But what the next part of the cycle is really about business kind of digesting that plan or that budget, and then being able to ask some of the strategic business questions about how do I go about achieving that. And this is where FP&A get involved again, where they start to look at how do I answer those questions, and really going and sourcing the data to kind of understand and solve a lot of those problems. one of the challenges we often see in FP&A is that FP&A have a whole bunch of data, and they normally send it down to the business. What we're really looking for is the business to ask those difficult questions, those real problems that they're trying to solve, and then for FP&A to go and find the data. So when we think about how the cycle goes, it really is a one-way clockwise cycle in this. From there, they create that business insight and then service their business partners with that insight. But in doing so, they also need to understand some of the fundamental things that are changing in the business and the impacts of the data that they're seeing. And the way that we see the cycle continue is that data insight is created into value, and then is starting to influence the strategy. So the way that we see the cycle is the beginning part of budgeting is really about understanding the insights from the last year and feeding those into the strategy and then designing the strategy. Jump to the next slide, Annie. So as a continuation of that, I just to kind of give you an overview of the way that we kind of see strategy. Good Strategy, Bad Strategy is a great book. Just if you get a chance to read it. Chapter 5 pretty much summarizes the whole strategy, but really divides it into 3 parts: the diagnosis, the guiding principles, and the coherent actions. When you think about strategy, it's really what are the challenges that the company is facing? What are the guiding principles to overcome those challenges and those obstacles? And then what are the coherent actions which the designed the actions that are really needed to take, the company needs to take to overcome the challenges. And I think if this methodology is followed, it makes it a lot easier for finance to get involved, because if you think about the first 2, those are kind of more where I would see kind of a strategy organization or a CEO playing a larger role. But really being able to take those actions, those coherent actions, and being able to then translate those into dashboards or part of the budget, etc. I think that's one of the key areas that finance can really get involved in that step 3. Next slide. And here we can see some of the research that's been done just on strategy itself by the Harvard Business Review. 95% of companies' employees are unaware of or do not understand its strategy. So I think, when we think about that and how important that role is of finance to be a key communicator of strategy, especially as part of the business partner relationship, I think the role of finance is heightened in this area. All right, let's jump to the next slide. So to give you a bit of background, Ernie, myself, and some other people have been putting together a survey, the FP&A Empowerment Survey. We had 311 respondents in November 2017. And the idea of this survey is to really start to understand the pulse of FP&A, specifically around planning, forecasting, budgeting, and other impacts that FP&A are having on the organization and technology. So this is some of the data that's been taken from this. If you get the handout and you go to the Bibliography, you can actually go and click on the link and actually go and view the survey and get more details from there. But really what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand from the marketplace and consumers, and the respondents were pretty much all over the world, all types of businesses and pretty much all different types of positions within businesses. What we're seeing is that when we think of the budgeting process, we're looking at a 1 to 3 month process, which is 55% of the time. The forecasting process, the majority of time is spent on forecasting is 3 to 4 days. But what was even more surprising is greater than 5 days is, we're really looking at a large chunk of people spending more than 5 or more days on the forecasting process, which kind of says to me that a lot of people are spending a lot of time on pulling numbers together. So this is one of the big challenges we're seeing in FP&A. We'll jump to the next slide. I think one of the frequency as well. So being able to pull a forecast together on a monthly basis and a quarterly basis seems to be the majority. We do see that at least 8% of the respondents actually do a forecast on a weekly basis. the idea here is that as you start to look at many of the components that are making up the P&L, we'll probably find that, you know, for example, when I was working in Dell, we did a weekly sales forecast. We didn't do necessarily a whole P&L. That happened on a monthly basis. So there can be a split between these, but what we're seeing is that, you know, the majority of people are doing it on a monthly basis. I think for Ernie and I, the biggest surprise was just kind of the next piece of just how the forecast accuracy, how accurate the forecasting was. We've spent a huge amount of time on forecasting. You know, we do it on a monthly basis on most cases, yet forecasting accuracy was okay or not good. So there was like 57% kind of in those two, 59 if you count the useless or poor. But you can see that there's a lot of work still to go. And I think, you know, as we start to think about techniques and how we look at forecasting, you know, moving away from the traditional methodology such as kind of the bottom-up and top-down views and moving to more driver-based is kind of one of the key areas. And then substituting those driver analytics with machine learning and AI, I think is going to be kind of the way that the future of forecasting is going to happen. So let's jump onto the next slide. So traditional forecasting and planning we have, and taken from the survey, we have at least 16% of companies doing a bottom-up forecasting. And bottom-up forecasting, for those people that don't know, is if you have a business segment, business unit, and business groups, that's how your business rolls up. Or companies at the bottom there. Each one of those rolls up so that the forecast is done at the lowest level. It then rolls up to the next level, and those people make up, you know, make a few adjustments. That gets rolled up to the next level. Those people make a few adjustments, and then that gets rolled up to the next level. This is a very time-consuming exercise, and the challenge that we've always had with this methodology is that when we start to do analytics at, say, for example, in this case, a business group level, you can see the top of the pyramid. The challenge is that when somebody asks a question, those people have to go down to the business unit level. And often the answer isn't at the business unit level. They have to go down to the business segment level, and then the product line level, in, you know, as an example, and that then gets rolled up again. So you can see just how time consuming it is to be able to understand any of the issues within the business. The nice thing about this methodology is that it gives you a lot of accountability. The next method is the top-down method. When you think about, and this is often used a lot in the planning or the budgeting, where you really start at the top and then you disseminate your numbers down. 14% of companies are focused on this area. And in total, 68% of companies use both methodologies. So you can see that in the top-down, the challenges with top-down is by building accountability. If you put the numbers in at the top and then those filter down to the bottom, the people at the business product line level often look at those numbers and they go, I don't recognize these numbers. I can't be accountable for numbers that I can't be held responsible for. So then in both, you know, both of these methodologies often are not ideal and they have their issues. If we can go to the next slide, please. Another methodology that's become quite popular over time is the rolling forecast. All the rolling forecast means is really being able to kind of decouple the budgeting and planning. So the idea being is that you budget once a period and you lock that budget, and then the idea of a rolling forecast is that in month one you would forecast, you've got actuals for month one, and you would forecast out for the next 12 months in this case. When you get to month two, you've got 2 months of actuals, and then you would continue to forecast out for the next 12 months. The advantage of this is that when you start to get to your next budgeting cycle, and we talked a bit about getting that insight into the planning, into the strategy cycle, this is a great way of doing it, because already by the time you've got halfway through the period, or the year in this example, you're able to start seeing Q1 and Q2 starting to take shape, and you can get a deeper understanding of kind of what the business is thinking and where the direction is. The challenge with this methodology, and we use this extensively in Nokia when we the challenge is that people tend to be very focused on the next quarter. So let's just take month one, for example, they'll be very focused on Q1, so they would be very focused on the next 2 months, and then maybe the next quarter. Q3 and Q4 would be kind of an afterthought, and there wouldn't be much focus. Month two and when you got to month 2 and month 3, you already now you're focusing on Q2 and maybe a little bit on Q3. So you're not really focusing on Q1, which is in the next year. It's more just an extrapolation. So you have to be a bit careful about that. 58% of companies use rolling forecasts, and 59% of companies feel they need to improve forecast accuracy. So still a long way to go. Next slide. So driver-based forecasting is kind of a concept that I think is being used extensively throughout organizations in sort of isolated areas, and I think that it applies itself extremely well to a couple of areas. I think the one that we're going to look at, the two, is kind of looking at salary costs based on headcount drivers, and then sales based on pipeline. But just to kind of give you an overview, so we're having, in this case, we're looking at salaries. We do headcount forecasting, so that kind of is we're building up the headcounts by the business. Then we have the average salary, and then we have foreign exchange. We may have bonus calculations on top of that. We times them all together. Now, what's happening is that as before, the business was forecasting a total number. So you may be still doing a bottom-up number, but instead of doing the bottom-up number based on your total salaries, you're now basing them on a bottom-up number on your headcount times by the average salary, which can either be an estimated amount or it can be given. And then you can, the foreign exchange typically comes from your treasury department. But the idea being here is that when you start to do analysis on your salary amount, you're able to then go and drill down into the headcount amounts to see kind of what are the headcount fluctuations that are happening, what fluctuations are being caused by average salary. So maybe there's been a whole lot of very expensive employees that are being hired, but the headcount numbers are staying relatively flat, but the numbers are obviously going up. We'll be able to drill down into all of that information. So it gives the reviewers of this far more power to be able to go and drill down into the information if this is done well. So if we go to the next slide, it's a slide that builds. So we'll just start here for a second. So one of the models that we've built recently for a company, they have about 6,000 employees in their kind of non-sales organization. So it's kind of the supporting functions, G&A functions. They wanted to be able to build out a model that helps them predict the costs of these the salary costs. So what we did is we took the general ledger data and we took the HR data. One of the challenges that you always have with HR data is that it's very confidential in some countries. It can't be shared outside of HR. So what we've done is we've created a methodology of extracting that data already masked so that you can't tell who the employee is and what their salary is. We then created an uplift cube. And the idea of creating an uplift cube is because the data in the HR is masked, what we're doing is we're trying to create at intersections, and in our case we used period, function, and region. We're trying to create what is the delta in the uplift from the HR data to the GL data. Now, often in the HR data, that is just salary. It doesn't necessarily have all their commissions, bonus, burdens, and things like that. So the idea was to create a lot of those things. We then took the HR data again, once we had that uplift factor, and we created a salary cube. And the idea of the salaries cube here is by employee ID, which was masked again, we could create by each instance a estimate of what their salary was based on the uplift factor, and then be able to extrapolate that out into the future. The idea of creating a cube is, if you think of a cube, it's equal on all sides. So in this case, we created employee ID. So every employee ID would have every period, and the periods actually extended out into the future. And this was a rolling forecast. So every month, a new period was added. To make sure and be able to manage the data in this, we actually created a salary reference data so that we could tie back non-identifiable pieces of data back to that instance, so that we could then build it out by function and region as well. And then what we did is we also, in the HR data, we also created an average salary, which again was a masked number. And once you applied the uplift factor, you got an approximation of what the salary was. For the periods file, this included the periods that we had extended out into the future. And then one of the key aspects of this model was, instead of people then predicting what the salary number was, what they were doing is they were entering in the to be hired headcount by the dimension of when they were going to be hired, what function they were in, and what region they were in. And then I think we also had what job grade they were expected to be in. And once we were able to do that, we were able to build out that full solution in that cube. And then we had an output which enabled the teams to then go and pull the summarized detail of that, because we didn't want to share the salary detail in there. So this kind of
James, let me jump in here a minute, because I think this is obviously one of the most important parts of your presentation, because we don't get this detail that often. So can you, I know we have a little limited time, but can you give us a little bit of background of, you say your output is an uplift factor. So can you give us a little more color on what that is? Is it a number? Is it a multiplier? And I'm just trying to help people get a little bit more, follow a little bit better.
Yeah, so the uplift factor is just a multiplier. And the idea, let's say there wasn't a masking on the HR data. Let's say the HR data was $100. You earned $100 a month, because we're doing it by monthly periods. The GL data is coming in at 130, and that's because you've got a burden of 30, which is all the medical and other costs that are associated with that employee. The uplift factor, what we were doing here is we were saying, okay, take the data from HR and times it by 1.3 to give us what we thought the total cost of the employee was. So it's really trying to get that total cost. In the case of this model, what we did is we masked those HR numbers, so we couldn't see what those HR numbers were, but they were all proportionally correct. It ended up, so say that it was originally 100, and then it was masked down to 60, say, or 50. And then, so that 50 then was then uplifted to the 130, just to kind of give you that proportional representation of how much that intersection would cost. So that was the idea of the uplift factor.
Okay, one more quick question, and these are the questions we'd get in the Q&A anyway, but since we're here, and if you can share, how do you mask the data? I've had a couple people asking about that here.
Yeah. So what we did is that the HR data was actually pulled from the HR systems into a SQL database. And in that SQL database, there were a couple of things that were happening. So the back end of the SQL database was controlled by the IT team, and we had no access to that piece of it. The first thing is that they were choosing randomized numbers for the employee IDs. And the second one was that they were given a factor to adjust what the salaries were in that database, so that when we got the output of the data, we couldn't tie, and also all of the identifying data was stripped out, so that we weren't able to get details of that data.
Okay, great, thank you.
And I think this is very important, especially in HR, to be able to make sure that we continue to maintain it, because ultimately, as a finance organization, we don't want to be held responsible for any data leaks or anything. So the further we can get away from identifiable data, the better. All right. So jumping now into more of a sales cost driver model. Sales is, you know, the way that we've approached this is probably slightly different to the way that we've approached the headcount model. When we looked at headcount, you know, we used the salaries model. We used headcount as the driver, and then we applied a whole lot of logic onto those headcounts to be able to kind of extrapolate those numbers forward and being able to predict that. When we're looking at, this is some of the work that we've done on sales drivers. One of the key thing with the sales driver is, and these numbers are all made up. This is just a demo. You can see if you go onto that bit.ly link, you can actually go and play around with this this demo here. And the idea of this is that we have what is called, you know, this is a sales plan. So this is based on what orders are coming in, not necessarily revenue. There's a lot more complexity that is involved when you want to start predicting revenue due to revenue recognition. But I wanted to keep it really simple for this discussion. But the idea being is that we have a plan. The plan you can see there at the top. We have a weekly forecast that goes into the numbers. Now, the weekly forecast is actually based on the pipeline. And the way that I've seen, the way that we've built this in a number of cases, the one case we actually had the sales, the way that the plan was built was a number of ways. The first one was, firstly, we would take the pipeline that has been won and committed. Anything that was won and committed automatically has to go into the plan. The users would then also have the ability to go and flag opportunities that were either won and committed that they wanted to take out of the plan. So say something's committed, but you think it's going to fall, and this is only for a specific quarter, by the way, and say you thought it was going to fall into another quarter, then you could flag it as not included in the plan. And then what you typically would do, though, is you would go through your pipeline and say, okay, I'm halfway through my quarter. I think that my forecast is, sorry, my plan is 80, in the case of America's Malcolm, my plan is 80,000. I have a won and lost of 77, but I've got another opportunity in there that it kind of gets me another 12 million, which takes me up to the 89,000, which is my forecast. Then I would flag that opportunity as an opportunity that I would then add into my forecast. The idea of this is then we can then go and drill down into the drivers that are making up that number. What we did find is even with the flags, there were cases where, for example, Malcolm might have 5 deals. They're all, you know, approximately about $12 million, and he doesn't know which one's going to land. He knows one of them is going to land by the end of the quarter, or he hopes one of them's going to land by the end of the quarter. So what we also built in is a section for discretion. So if you didn't know exactly which one it was, then you could put in a number for discretion. So when we think about planning and being able to drill down into the numbers, you know, it's really, if you have your 89 made up of opportunities, then it's easy to drill down into, okay, these are the opportunities he's going to close. If there's a piece of that that's just discretion, or then it's kind of what you have to do is you have to, as a reviewer of this, you have to drill down into kind of that detail of what's making up that discretion and how he's going to cover that off, because maybe he's got some opportunities against that, maybe he needs to bring in opportunities. But this dashboard really gives you kind of a visual. It doesn't necessarily show the workings of the forecast, but at least it gives you the visual of kind of how the plan is factoring the percentage plan against the forecast. It also shows some of the key metrics when we're thinking about sales of, you know, how many times are we covered, the pipeline is covered. So what is our total pipeline for the quarter versus what the plan is, how much has he already won, and then kind of what is the factored pipeline. And sometimes this was taken from salesforce.com, but the idea is that you can enter in, do you think it's going to be a 10% or a 30%, 50%, or 90%? So that gives you kind of where you think that factoring is going to be. So this kind of gives you an idea of some of the dashboards that you can create from this. But the underlying drivers of in this case was really about understanding the pipeline and drilling into that pipeline. There is another section to this that actually converts that into revenue, where we use some of the revenue recognition rules, as well as some of the historical predictions to kind of get you to a revenue number. All right. I hope that kind of any questions on the revenue side.
Oops, too far. Yeah, can you give us a little bit of color on the coverage side, the pipeline coverage, just a little bit there?
Yeah, so the pipeline coverage is really about understanding how many times your pipeline, which is your total pipeline of all your opportunities, covers your forecast. So in this case, the 89 is your forecast, and we've got 3 times the amount of pipeline that covers our forecast, which basically means that we would be able to, assuming we closed everything, we're going to do 263,000. But we only targeting at doing just under 90,000. So that's kind of the coverage aspect of it, and that's just a metric to kind of make sure. If you think about dashboards and making them actionable, and in this case, it's really about, if your coverage is too low, then the opportunity, like you can see Bob there, he's only got a 1.9 coverage. It's really about, do we need to go and get more opportunities, find more opportunities in that area, and that's kind of what that's driving.
Okay, great, thank you.
So if we have a look at integrated planning, which is kind of the next phase, and I think the alignment's gone out slightly there, but the idea of the traditional way of planning is really looking at each one of these in silos. So sales teams would go out and do their sales planning, supply chain would do their supply chain planning, OPEX, there would be some interaction between the two, but OPEX typically would do their OPEX planning independent of everybody else. And the ones that we've seen the most issues are around OPEX. For example, sales start to dip, and OPEX has gone up, because we were expecting sales to increase. There needs to be a faster interaction between what's happening on the sales end of it and the rest of the organization to build that perfect P&L. So, when we think about integrated planning, we're really looking at how we can integrate sales, supply chain, and OPEX, so that when we're doing the planning, all of that data is fed through into a single plan seamlessly, so that we're able to do planning, and the impacts of our sales, increasing or decreasing sales, has an automatic impact onto supply chain and OPEX. So that's the idea of integrated planning. And the idea being is we'll continue to build that out. But let's go on to the next polling question.
All right, thanks, sir. Give James a little time to catch his breath from all that great insights and detail. Really awesome to see some detail behind what we often hear about so often. So asking you to share with us how large a role Excel plays in your forecasting planning cycle. Again, we options 100%, a large majority, maybe between 50 and 75%. It's used less than other tools, so less than 50%, maybe a combination, or we never use Excel. So I'll be interested to see where that number falls. Again, we appreciate everyone's consideration in answering the polling questions. In order to be mindful of our time, I'm going to go ahead and leave the polling question up for a few more seconds, and then we'll talk about the evolution and the technology, Excel, some of its limitations, and then where we can go from there, and the value that can be gained from doing so. So let me go ahead and close the polling question and go ahead and share those results. And just anything really quickly, James, that stands out here to you?
Yeah, and I think this is pretty much standard across everybody, and I think we're missing the 50 to 75% one, where you combine them together. But the majority of people, I think, are using Excel extensively for planning, and they may not be using it 100%, although we see at least 39% using it 100%. But even what we're seeing is a lot of these enterprise solutions need a lot of sort of this driver-based analysis that is done on the side, and that's often done on Excel. So let's jump to the next one. I'm gonna go through that. We've got a section on Excel. I'm going to go through relatively quickly on this, because just in the interest of time, so we can get on to some of the other good stuff. But the idea here is that article in Forbes magazine really kind of highlighted some of the challenges. You know, when you've got Excel, you've got everybody's creating their own model, so you've got everybody creating an Excel model. So the amount of time spent on creating the model, checking it, etc., is, you know, sucks up a lot of the expensive resources. Spreadsheets. Errors, I think in this article they said that there was a $6 billion error caused by an Excel spreadsheet. I mean, a lot of the time they say that 1 in 100 spreadsheets have an error. I think it's probably more than that, but you know, there are little errors that creep in and become challenges, especially when everybody's using Excel. When spreadsheets creators leave, the knowledge leaves with them. This is I've got a great example of this where somebody created a cash flow, a pretty detailed cash flow Excel spreadsheet, and I was actually brought in halfway through because they're unable to translate it all. And I'll give you an example of how we built it a little later on. And then some of the reasons why I think that, especially around planning, why spreadsheets are a challenge. You know, we saw that a lot of people are using spreadsheets both in and outside of a planning solution, but, you know, valuable information is stored offline. So all that driver information that you're kind of building out of, you know what headcount you've got and what salaries you're using and things like that is all being stored on somebody's desktop in an Excel spreadsheet. If you could bring that online and do the analysis across the company, that'd be very powerful. Data is captured by multiple people and consolidate is prone to error. We see this a lot that you know, people do a forecast and they create an Excel template, send it to 50 people, bring it back, and then try and consolidate it. Excel doesn't do that particularly well. Versioning can be difficult, and what we're talking about here is when we switch from, say, January's forecast to February's forecast, and then try and compare February against January. Again, Excel is not great at doing that. And data is not secure. If somebody gets hold of those spreadsheets, they have all of your data. So let's go to the next slide. So why is Excel here to stay? After saying all the reasons why we should leave Excel, I'm a huge proponent of Excel. I think it's a great solution. I just think that we have to know its limitations and where to use it and where to use some of the new technology. I think, you know, it's easy, and the speed you can create models is very fast. You don't rely on IT, or you don't need to raise a PO to get a software approved. Everybody has Excel on their computers, or I think most people do. The great thing about Excel is that there's online access to training. Often I go on to solve a problem, and there's always somebody else that's had that same problem. So, you know, being able to watch a YouTube video or just search up a formula or challenge that you're having, I think is amazing, because, you know, you pretty much get any question answered. And also Excel is advanced. I use extensively Power Query, Power Pivot, and Power BI. Now in Power BI, Power Query and Power Pivot reside, but you can use them independently of Power BI. Power Query is really the tool that helps you to connect, shape, and cleanse your data. It's a great tool, because what you can do is you can pivot data. You can pretty much connect. They've got a huge amount of native collection built-in connections, so you can connect to a large variety of sources, or you can set up a ODBC connection to your data source. So you can connect directly to the data and then be able to manipulate that data within Power Query. Power Pivot is where you do all your data modeling. The great thing about this is it works like a database. So you put in a formula and it works on columns as opposed to cells. And then Power BI gives you that visualization piece. So if we go to the next slide. So typically when I'm building an Excel spreadsheet, what I try to do is I try to connect directly to whatever the gold source is. If I can't do that, then I would extract that into a SQL with an automation so that I can pull that data seamlessly. Sorry. And I'd use Power Query to do that. I would make sure that I do all my formulas, my lookup tables, my links, etc., my sums in Power Pivot. And then the only formula I'm allowed to use in my Excel template is get pivot data, because what Power Pivot does is it creates a pivot table, and then what you can do is you can create templates on the front of it, and you use the get pivot data, and you use slices to be able to manipulate your data. It makes it a very powerful tool. I often add in Power BI in between Power Pivot and Power the Excel as well, to add a security layer as well. But then you can also use the visualization of that as well. So this is how we built the cash flow model. It still remains today, very little maintenance. Everything is managed through all the logic is managed through the SQL database or in the Power Pivot, and all the user has to do is press a refresh button to pull the latest data down into the cash flow, and then they can visualize the data through the various methods in the Excel pivot table. All right. So what other options do you have besides Excel? We've spent a lot of time covering Excel. So, there's a couple of things. We often see databases and web interfaces being built by companies. These are typically done kind of purpose-built for the company, whether they do it themselves, or it could be an Access database. We see a lot of those where planning is done and people go in and enter their data into that. The challenge with that is it does require a lot of IT support. You are dependent on, you could lose data because if they're not proper backups, and interfaces can be difficult to change. What we're seeing is there's a huge amount of cloud purpose-built planning solutions and modeling solutions, and I want to just distinguish between the two. The planning solution is purpose-built for planning. You throw in your trial balance and you can do it. They've already have templates already set up for you to go and put in the forecast. Modeling solutions are solutions where you actually, similar to Excel, you're creating the model itself and you're creating the interface yourself. But however, it's on the web in the cloud, as opposed to Excel, which is on a desktop. The limitations of the purpose-built ones, they have, because they standardize, there's limited availability for customization, and we've seen limited scenario modeling capabilities. Normally you have to take your data offline and model externally. The cloud planning solutions, there's a lot of benefits, but you're really looking at the challenges are there is a limited amount of data, especially when you think about the intersections of data, how many dimensions you want to plan it. There are limits, but some of the other things is you need internal expertise to be able to maintain the models as well. So although it's not necessarily an IT team, what we're seeing is companies building up what they call center of excellence, where they have teams that are able to, within finance, for example, that are able to build those models out. And then you get the ERP solutions. What are we seeing with the ERP solutions is that the ERP typically work for corporate planning, but when you need something dynamic, then the cloud solutions typically work better for business planning. So what we're seeing the best solution is really having an ERP solution for your corporate planning, which is a standardized planning solution. But when you want to get agile and look at things in a lot of different ways and start to look at driver-based analytics and things like that, then sort of the cloud planning models and cloud purpose-built solutions are often great solutions to kind of augment that ERP. This gives you just a kind of an overview. So let's jump in. No, go back. So Excel, typically, the number of users is the kind of the gating factor. The more users you have, size is not necessarily an issue, but the more users you have, the more issues you're going to have. The web-based ones, users are not necessarily an issue, but data size can often be an issue. And when we're talking data size, we're also talking the number of dimensions. And the last one, ERP. Typically, you don't want to be spending it on when there's a small number of users and a small data size. So that kind of gives you an idea. It's very rough. of the different solutions and when they're more applicable. But what we're seeing is that people are starting to use more than one solution. So you might have an ERP solution, you might have a cloud-based solution supporting your ERP solution, and then you would have even people using Excel to do even more complex scenario analysis. Okay. Next is kind of AI and the rise of the machine. So what we're seeing a lot now is artificial intelligence, or especially machine learning, is starting to take a larger role in finance. It's at the moment we're not seeing a huge amount in planning, and we'll get onto that. But let's just jump to the next thing. So Moravec's Paradox basically states that computers are really good at doing sort of very intelligent things, playing checkers and really difficult, complex problem solving. But they are challenged with perception and mobility. So when you see a robot trying to walk, it always looks a bit stuttered. But like the one thing in finance is kind of perception. Computers struggle with perception. So AI, I think, is going to take a larger role within the finance organization, but I do see that there are things like perception where people still need to be involved and still continue to add value, especially in things like FP&A and analytics and being able to interpret things. But go to the next slide. So really, the real advantage is reducing the natural bias, and this is critical in decision making across companies. If you want to get a completely unbiased solution answer, you're really using artificial intelligence to kind of do that analysis. But even then, it can be programmed to be biased. I don't think, when we think about how we do analytics, it's one of the questions I always ask. The first question is, what do you want the answer to be? Because I think people always have a biased opinion on what they want the answer to be. So it's important that they are able to build out a unbiased answer. It also kind of explores the unknown unknowns. They are able to see things and do correlation and points of correlation that we wouldn't even think of thinking about. And then being able to analyze large amounts of data. Data is growing exponentially, so the challenges of data continue to be that we need to be able to analyze them, and AI will start to take a larger role. Next slide. The current barriers, just the volume of data in finance is actually pretty small. And especially when we think about planning, until we really start to look at driver-based and start to do analytics on driver-based, I think we're not, if you look at like the way that we're doing planning at the moment, I don't think it's optimal for AI. Data is very messy. If you look at planning especially, it's kind of a consolidation of a huge amount of factors to give you a single number of what you think your salaries are going to be. It can be skewed for previous quarters because we looked at it slightly differently. And the current cost of AI is expensive. Hiring expensive data scientists as well as bringing in AI software can be very expensive, but those costs are coming down. But what I wanted to do is get onto this one, and I know we've only got like a minute left, but really this is kind of my vision for the future, this idea of interpredictive planning. We talked about the various pieces of planning, but really, it's about humans taking responsibility for kind of the real big drivers like sales, and then the machines kind of working out what is the optimal P&L behind that. So this is kind of a concept that I've kind of started working on. I'd love to hear everybody's opinion on it. But the idea being here is that there's an opportunity for us to be able to kind of help build out the drivers, and then the machines kind of do more prediction on kind of what the optimal P&L is, and then everybody track to that P&L. It's kind of a combination of all the other methodologies we spoke about. Next slide. All right, and this is just a quick thank you for everybody for attending. If you want to connect on LinkedIn, that would be great. There's also my latest blog on artificial intelligence. I know we kind of jumped through it pretty quickly, but it would be great. You could read it in a little bit more detail on some of the other topics that have been pretty popular.
All right, thank you very much, sir. Also on the deck, we have some additional resources and sites from James's great content. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up here. A few closing comments. I have a couple polling questions I'd like to leave up for 30 seconds or so. So I just want to once again thank James for his great content and his thought leadership in this area. So thank you very much. Tremendous insights into areas that I think we need to take a deeper dive into. Also want to thank our sponsor as well, Senage, and their commitment to thought leadership. As you had seen through the webinar, definitely James gave us an unbiased opinion of all the solutions and the ups and downs, but there's absolutely a lot of value to be gained in terms of the cloud-based solutions, in terms of the scenario analysis and the modeling and the complexity that we can deal with as well. Also want to note, as I launch our final polling question here, that once the webinar is over, you will be able to have the opportunity to request to be connected with James with a few mouse clicks, and also be able to connect with our sponsor and learn more about how the cloud-based modeling and planning solutions can be beneficial to your company as well. And I encourage you to visit the Sentage website, but also the website that James has as well. As James mentioned, we will be putting out a survey, the FP&A Empowerment Survey. We would sincerely appreciate your consideration in participating in that survey, and so we can continue to deliver thought leadership and insights of what's actually going on out there in the world. And finally, I would like to thank you, the audience, for your valuable time today. Thank you very much. Make the rest of your day great.